out.
No, don't! You'll poison yourself! How am I going to poison myself? It's just face powder. It makes you look paler because it's got lead in it. That's poisonous. Lead? We've known that's dangerous for like a century. But I thought all old makeup had lead in it. This is rice starch. You could eat this. It's fine. Do you think we're all stupid? I have way too much work to do to wear something that's bad for me just because it's pretty. You used to work at Sephora. Yes. Weirdest ingredient you've ever had a customer freak out at you about?
Guanine. The name is derived from guano. There is a way that you can derive guanine from guano, but the guanine that is used in ingredients for makeup is derived from fish scales. So having to say, no, there isn't poop in your mascara is a conversation I've had to have. Polyethylene glycol as opposed to ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol is used in antifreeze. Polyethylene glycol used in moisturizers.
There was a time in a setting where having to freak out about antifreeze in your makeup was a very legitimate concern. And that is why we are here today. Hi, I'm the fashion history and cosmetic chemistry nerd, and today I have with me a very special and exciting guest, my friend Liz of LizCapism.
I worked at a Sephora as well as in a variety of fragrance stores. I have a lot of experience with contemporary regulations as they affect the retail market.
I was a hairdresser for several years, going into product formulas and trying to figure out what was or wasn't going to work for my clients' needs. I thought it would be interesting to just dig back into a lot of the myths about cosmetic safety, how we got to where we are today from the supposed bad old days of people painting their faces with white lead.
The story is so quickly summarized with back in ye olde times, everything was terrible and we put poison all over ourselves. But then regulations, and nobody really seems to fill in the blanks with any kind of history or understanding of how that might have happened or how long it took.
Yeah, the old days were rough, but that didn't mean people were stupid. They had some sense of what was or was not dangerous because people died from things.
You say people aren't stupid. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they were, and people continue to do things that we know are dangerous today, like tanning salons. People still smoke. People are people, and
there are always going to be some people who will take fashion to extremes. The folks that were painting their faces with white lead in the 1600s were the very upper classes.
People knew that lead was bad for you back then. It's just a case of how bad.
What point is it maybe worth it if you are trying to be that extra fashionable? I would love to live in a world where we could trust that somebody was not going to try to bend the truth a little bit to sell you something, but we don't currently live in that world. I'm certainly not saying I would rather go back to the past where, you know, things like deodorant didn't exist. Native Deodorant have been so kind as to sponsor this video. Native have just launched their new deodorant and body spray collection, a new way to use and enjoy Native's wonderful scents. Great for using on underarms or for all over odor protection and fragrance. These have all the good qualities of a stick deodorant, but with a light as air mist texture from an ozone-friendly, nitrogen-propelled aerosol that's also recyclable. They apply super easily and dry on contact thanks to fast-drying and odor-fighting corn-derived denatured alcohol. The ingredient list in this stuff is only 6 things long.
Super basic.
On account of being 6 things, it's also vegan, aluminum-free, paraben-free, so if you avoid any of those things, you're good to use this. The spray comes in 6 scents: cucumber and mint, eucalyptus and mint, coconut and vanilla, and the 3 we tried. The sea salt and cedar is my favorite. Fresh, clean, woodsy sort of thing without falling into the trap of like, this is dude fragrance for men.
I always struggle with floral fragrances when it isn't an actual perfume. It is so sickly sweet. The lilac and white tea is actually super light, more clean and floral than it does sugary and cloying floral. It's really quite lovely.
Sweet peach and nectar. It's got that little bit of tartness. If you like your fruit scents to smell like an actual piece of fruit, you'll like this. It's clear, so like I can wear this with a black t-shirt, and under historical costumes it might be a little trickier to launder deodorant stains out of. We wear tested this by going out Irish dancing. Yes, I had worked up a sweat. No, I did not smell unpleasant. Native also makes amazing body washes, lotions, and plastic-free stick deodorant in some of these same scents. Use my link and code SnappyDragon to get 20% off your first purchase at Native. This offer is available site-wide, but only for a limited time, so stock up and save. So back in the day, 1500s through much of the 19th century, food and cosmetics and a lot of what we would think of as like over-the-counter medications were all sort of like grouped together as in like things that somebody made at home in their kitchen. The notion of regulating them at all was not completely new. Like in the Middle Ages, there were regulations that applied to like the purity of bread. Medieval bakers were being regulated is because they were selling it and providing to a whole community, and like you could have people being malnourished if their bread didn't have as many calories as it was meant to. That you even could regulate something that somebody was making at home in their kitchen for their own use. Even today, good luck doing that. Everybody loves to get excited about white lead foundation in the past the way people get excited about horror movies.
We know that people knew that it was bad for you, and we knew that people were coming up with different solutions.
By the 18th century, we have written evidence. They had gotten a sense that it was bad for you. They were starting to develop ways of getting their hands on other pigments that if you wanted to paint your face white, would do a better job of it. A book called Abdacard by Antoine Le Camus in 1757, and there's a recipe for face paint that includes white lead, but then he says there are other ingredients that give better color. I was reading Toilette de Flora, which is a pretty famous book of 18th century makeup and personal care recipes. There was some lead in other preparations, but not for face paint. By the 19th century, the heavy white face makeup had gone out of fashion. There was still the societal beauty standard of having very pale skin, and that was for reasons of racism and classism and colorism, and if I talked through all of those, we would be here for hours and that would be a whole other video.
So much
but
video.
In recipe books from the 19th century, you're more likely to see starch, talc, French chalk, some derivatives of bismuth, which isn't exactly great for you, but it's not as bad as lead, crushed pearls, and titanium dioxide, which is in modern sunscreens. Like that's on my face right now.
Most mineral sunscreens nowadays will have titanium dioxide as one of the main ingredients.
Arnold J. Cooley in 1666, there's a book that he wrote that has a bunch of recipes for lead-free white tinted face cosmetics, and he complains that there were still high status ladies at that time using lead, even though it was known to be extremely dangerous. Also, apparently it reacted badly with coal smoke, so that could cause your makeup to go gray or black. The 19th century equivalent of when you put on foundation and then it oxidizes and your face is orange.
I can so see that being a thing that comes up in a conversation between ladies of like, oh, you know what I heard or what I saw or what I experienced.
This embarrassing thing happened to so-and-so. It was really only when cosmetics started to transition to being produced outside of the home on an industrial scale, you would buy it from a professional.
The mid-19th century is where we start to get things like patent medicines being advertised and food being not only sold in mass market fashion, but also packaged in new ways. The market is flooded with all of these things that nobody knows 100% what's in them or how they were made or in what conditions, and suddenly everybody's got a mess on their hands.
When did we actually start regulating what was in makeup?
Strangely complicated question. The ingredients, the manufacturing, all kinds of other things started to be regulated first. Food was the big one to start with. Food purity was the movement that it was referred to, and this idea that you wanted to be able to make sure that food was safe. A chemist by the name of Harvey Washington Wiley was put in charge of the FDA earlier in around the 1880s. He established a series of what he referred to as table trials to prove by a series of experiments on live humans that food additives that were not regulated could potentially have problematic health effect. The most sort of noteworthy was borax. 12 participants eat every single meal that they ate in a day for several months come from a particular preparation in the basement of what became the FDA. These experiments led to essentially proof positive that you did need to regulate food additives because people were adding things unethically, which is not also something that anybody had ever thought would be possible. Why would you add poison to food?
Why would you add poison to food? Capitalism. Yay! Regardless of their failure to live up to our current standards, they were a super important benchmark.
Alice Lakey, who was a campaigner for pure food, and Fanny Farmer, she very much campaigned in a lot of different ways for quality and consistency in food, both in general, as well as actually for the disabled and people in convalescent homes and things like that. They are super responsible in a lot of ways for a lot of this getting the momentum that it did. Alice Lakey especially was responsible for having over 1 million people write to the government to campaign for an actual act, which at this point had been quashed so many times because of food lobbyists and
Capitalism.
Capitalism. So in 1906, the Pure Food and Drug Act was passed, and that was largely concentrated on food and patent medicine and drugs. It didn't actually directly affect cosmetics, but a lot of the ingredients that were regulated would also be the kinds of things that would be regulated for cosmetics. This act, unfortunately, also lacked teeth. Claims. This is the other thing that's big in cosmetics that is worth talking about.
Oh my goodness.
Literally, what they put on the packaging, what they say it does it actually do that? That was not something that was regulated. As a result, a lot of things, especially with medicine, immediately fraudulent. There was an amendment in 1912, the Shirley Amendment, which explicitly prevented fraudulent claims, especially of a therapeutic nature, contingent on it having an intent to defraud. The number of ways that you can weasel out of a thing with slippery language, 20s to the early 1930s, and this is starting to become a real problem, but still nobody's talking about it, at least not at a federal level.
The 20s are also a period where you start to see this explosion of makeup, because now it was fashionable to say you used makeup rather than it was fashionable to use makeup but pretend that you didn't.
In 1933, the chief education officer, Ruth DeForest Lamb, and the chief inspector of the FDA assembled an exhibition for the Chicago World's Fair, and they displayed all of these different objects and items that were available to the public. All had serious toxic effects, medicines that caused problems, other things to do with food preparation. Prominently featured in this display was a few items including Lash Lure.
Yes, oh goodness. So Lash Lure is one of the more famous 20th century cosmetics that could kill you. I think there was at least one person who did die of an allergic reaction to it, but there were a lot more people who had slightly less severe negative health effects than dying. It's an eyelash and eyebrow dye that's coal tar based, which is something that is not good for you. Unfortunately, some of the ingredients that made Lash Lure so dangerous are not regulated out of use. They're just regulated so you have to stick a warning on the box.
Eleanor Roosevelt did a tour of it with a reporter, and she referred to it as like a room of horrors. In 1937, a drug that had been previously approved through the Pure Food and Drug Act in a capsule and a powder form was reformulated due to popular demand into a liquid form. The ingredients that were added to make it a liquid made it poisonous, legitimately just straight up and down
not
toxic.
Like you might be allergic, not like it's not good for you, it will kill you.
And it resulted in hundreds of deaths across the United States, slow uptake of the response from the drug company, difficulty with engaging that kind of large-scale recall,
and the desire to sweep under the rug.
Absolutely.
And what have you. So this was called the elixir sulfanimide incident. The
elixir
The elixir sulfanilamide. We'll put it on the screen. You can try saying it at home. Tell us how it goes in the comments.
It's a really gut-wrenching bit of a letter that a doctor wrote to a friend. Despite having lived with death because practicing medicine for a quarter of a century, this was the most horrific experience he had ever gone through. That is an account that is taken directly from the FDA website. Regulations are 100% written in blood. We did have to be woken up as a society to just how serious and the need for these things were. This is not an overabundance of caution. These are things that have a deeply, deeply problematic history. I think it's a genuine disservice that all we do for a shorthand is talk about lead makeup when all of these other things are in living memory, never mind kind of more significant to the effects that these had in law over time.
This new act added factory inspections, court injunctions, and there were like minimum standards applied.
Now, with the inclusion of cosmetics explicitly and as distinct from drugs and food, there was a lot more that people could do to make sure that the things that we were putting on our faces and on our skin were safer. This is actually a definition that remains true roughly today. One is used in the diagnosis, cure, or mitigation of disease, intended to alter the structure of the body.
Or function of the body, which led to some interesting court cases in the 1960s. Cosmetics are articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance.
A line of demarcation that we learned about at Sephora was the idea that if it penetrated past the subdermal layer of the skin and you claimed that on the packaging, it had to be classified as a drug. This is where we come to a lot of language about things like wrinkles and wrinkle remover.
And that's how you got those court cases in the 1960s about wrinkle remover creams. And the upshot of that was basically like, if you're going to talk about a wrinkle remover, then congrats, you're talking about something that affects the structure and function of the body. It's a drug, you have a different set of rules to follow. If you're talking about a moisturizer or something that plumps up your skin or something that makes your skin radiant, that's a cosmetic.
Even in the studies that they cite on the back of moisturizers and things like that, it'll be reduces the appearance of wrinkles over a 28-day period.
People found their skin more radiant. What does radiant skin even mean?
I come from Canada and we have a slightly different set of regulations. Oftentimes, ingredients wouldn't cross the border. Hydroquinone, which is to this day not available in Canada for any products that you can buy in Canada.
It is available in the US. I think for certain strengths you need a prescription.
Often used in products that are referred to as dark spot remover or dark spot reducer. The difference between remover or improver or brightener or things like that is down to the fuzziness and the slipperiness of language. We are being very America-centric, and the reason for that is America led the way in the large-scale regulation of a lot of these things that didn't exist before.
They had reason to be, and that's because we have records of people coming to America from other countries. There's actually a letter from Charles Dickens that I ended up reading in middle school. He comes to the US and he talks about impure and corrupt and low quality a lot of the products in America are. And the milk has been watered down and then there's been chalk added to make it look like it's not watered down.
These regulations that existed in 1938, they're also still extant.
There have been some amendments in them in the intervening 90 years or so.
The government has to kind of take a step back and look at, okay, how can we prevent this from being an open question that has to go to court? So things like color additives and caffeine was actually a very early example.
Color additives were in the original act, and that's still very much the foundation for color additives in cosmetics today.
Education and packaging and claims, those are the things that also have started to get more and more attention, making sure that all of the ingredients that are listed are also listed by weight.
With American cosmetic labeling, at least, they have to list the ingredients on the label. With some exceptions, they have to do it basically in descending order of quantity. So the first ingredient, there's most of that, the last one there's least. Although when you get below a certain percentage, then they can just go alphabetical. And if it's both a cosmetic and a drug, they sort of separate out the ingredient that's considered the drug ingredient. And then they do the rest of the ingredient list in alphabetical order separately. The amendments we've had since the 1930s.
Oh my goodness. 1938, the Wheeler-Lee Act, the Black Book, Durham-Humphrey Amendment, 1951, Miller Pesticide Amendment. That's probably a fun court case to read from 1954. Food additives, color additives, drug amendments, Anti-Tampering Act. Keep having to go detail by detail. But we do kind of max out eventually.
There are so many steps in creating something. Raw materials have to be gotten, it has to be combined into whatever it's going to be, it has to be packaged, it has to be got to the consumer, it has to be marketed, it has to be sold, it has to be brought home, and then it has to sit in the consumer's possession for however long.
And it has to be either clearly labeled or effectively labeled as having a certain shelf life, or it has to remain a certain kind of safe, knowing that consumers aren't going to be conscious of that. You can only regulate so much at a certain point without it becoming just completely unfeasible. And as a result, we do still, despite the fact that we have all of these regulations and despite the fact that a lot of work has been gone into making them safe, we do still have to be conscious consumers.
Absolutely. Even 10 years ago, the Drug Quality and Security Act was in response to another one of these major incidents where people got hurt.
It isn't something that can stagnate, and it is actually a bone of contention with a lot of advocates that it is probably time for another act, but that's not really our
Yeah.
That's not really our place, but it is something that comes up.
We don't work in government. We are cosmetic and fashion history nerds. Our job is not to run the country.
Oh, would that it were, though.
I don't want that kind of work. No, thank you. Current cosmetic regulation and the state of this, and a lot of this does go straight back to that 1938 act that formed the FDA in its known form. Adulterated and misbranded cosmetic. Adulterated means, I think the direct quote is, bears or contains poisonous or deleterious substances which may render it injurious to users under the conditions of use prescribed in the labeling, except that this provision shall not apply to coal tar hair dye. Coal tar hair dye being the stuff that was in Lash Lure. There isn't an advance approval situation. There's basically just a, by the way, if you put something that's known to be bad for humans in this, it's illegal. Misbranded is to do with the labeling. It has to be properly classified as a cosmetic, follow the appropriate set of regulations for its classification. You can also be both a cosmetic and a drug. Most sunscreens in the US are both a cosmetic and a drug. They also have to follow certain labeling regulations. So that's where you get into the ingredient list has to say XYZ. It has to have the ingredients list in the order. It can't say it has something that it doesn't in it, and it can't say it's free of things that it contains. Honestly, what I used to end up telling my clients is the ingredients list is going to be the most solidly true information on that package. Disregard everything else. It's supposed to be not false or misleading. But again, that is slippery language. FDA does not have the energy to keep tabs on it, and it is an after-the-fact situation. But another thing that got regulated more in the 1960s was CFCs.
What's super interesting about this is that it is regulated, but similar to a lot of other things, they are more regulated. They're not entirely regulated, and they're not outright banned, and so we do have to actually still worry about CFCs in our products, in our aerosol sprays especially. Chlorofluorocarbons.
I'll put the name on the screen.
Yeah, currently being phased out and replaced with hydrochlorofluorocarbons and hydrofluorocarbons, which are also somewhat destructive to the planet, but less so. These ingredients were released into the atmosphere and they depleted the ozone layer. That's one of the reasons that we have a hole in the ozone. Environmental factors, including things like microbeads.
The microbeads that a lot of people probably heard about being banned from face wash. I think the way this was talked about is like, oh, your face wash is killing fishes. Your personal face wash, probably not killing fishes. The industrial creation of your face wash, yeah, that might be killing fishes.
Along with CFCs, there is huge amounts of backstock of these things that simply cannot be thrown away because it would be more destructive to the planet that way. And so they are allowed to essentially being gradually used up. We talk about being a conscious consumer, knowing that regulations and knowing that something is bad is not the same as being totally free from it in all product. I was working at Sephora at the time when the most recent drug regulation amendment came in 2013. There was new definitions for drugs and sunscreen specifically, and that had an effect on Canadian regulations because all of a sudden our definitions either had to change or had to be adapted. There was usually a sample product of whatever you wanted to try. We were sent the testers sometimes separately from the actual product. They would be labeled ever so slightly differently. They wouldn't necessarily hold up to labeling standards for Canada. Usually the problem is that it has to have French on it. In order to claim an SPF protection rating, you had to be approved by Health Canada for a drug identification number, which then had to be printed on the labeling. So the packaging for all of these products wouldn't have a drug identification number, they wouldn't have an SPF claim, but the testers would. The tester having the word SPF on it when the product didn't was a huge problem. A lot of products that had SPF in the States had these really awful stickers. And we had to explain for consumers who were aware of the SPF rating in the United States, we were also not allowed to say that it had an SPF rating because those claims also transfer to the things we were allowed to say verbally. So we just had to say, in the US, it has an SPF rating and the ingredients aren't different.
In any era, because of this, it is so important to be a conscious consumer and have at least some sort of sense of what is going in or on your body, whether you're in the 1500s and whether you're talking about cosmetics then or now. I have to check in with you about your hair oil because it's sitting on my bathroom counter right now. The way it's marketed makes you think it is primarily made out of argan oil, and it is actually primarily made out of liquid silicone. That's what you intend to be putting in your hair. Great, fine, use it. If you want straight argan oil, just you're better off getting that at a health food shop. So a lot of these problems are not as old or not as exclusively new as they're often presented to us. People using potentially dangerous cosmetics, even though they knew they weren't the greatest thing for you, needing to remain aware of the potential for putting something on your face that is maybe not what you want to be putting on your face. Regulation is important because it's what stops companies selling you things that might kill you. It doesn't matter what century you're in, people will try to do that. Our current regulation system does technically prevent lead in your foundation. It does do that. But regulation was not what killed white lead foundation. That was public opinion and common sense.
Thinking that everything in the past was either completely toxic or alternatively completely wonderful
fine.
And all natural, blah, 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 all of
Like,
these
you know
words.
what's natural? Arsenic and microbes. Those are natural. You probably don't want to put those on your person.
It's always important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater with old ways of doing things, with history. We very much are a big fan of history in this in this
house.
Yeah, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we're also conscious of the fact that contemporaneity and new things aren't necessarily always better, but they're not necessarily always worse. We really want to be able to know that there is good and bad and be conscious of those differences and make decisions accordingly.
And part of the joy of studying history is getting to go and look back and be like, okay, this was a really clever idea, and maybe it shouldn't have got out of standard use, but if it comes back into the modern world, it's going to take a different form. Our reusable cleaning cloths do not look the same as reusable cleaning cloths in the 18th century. That doesn't mean reusable cleaning cloths are not a great idea. Thank you for sitting with us for however many minutes this ends up being of us chattering basically about all of the nonsense we had to deal with at our old jobs. You can find Liz around the internet at LizCapism.
Everything.
Everything. YouTube, Instagram. And you also have LizCapism.com. You have a beautiful, shiny website.
I do.
You can find me around the internet at Miss SnappyDragon, Miss SnappyDragon on YouTube, SnappyDragon Studios on Patreon. If you want our source notes, they are juicy. In conclusion, there isn't lead in your foundation today. There probably also wasn't lead in your foundation in the Victorian era. We can put that myth just a little bit to bed.
Oh, thank goodness. There isn't bat guano in your mascara.
But you should still change your mascara every 3 months.
Yes, please do that. Oh, be responsible consumers, everybody.
But what about the corsets? Those were bad for you. I do not have time for this conversation. Go watch another video if you really want to know.